But also, let me mention one thing. It is very important. The people sometimes forget about this, and it's really important to inoculate the silage when they do it. It really is really beneficial. If one thing they take from this podcast is please inoculate your silages. It will help in the reduction of that pH, and it can also help, depends on what type it is. It can help in the life shelf of it, or after you open the aerobic stability, that is called, which is how much time you can have them exposed to air without this material going bad. Because if you put all the effort in the crop, if you put all the effort in the harvest, and then you forgot to add a few cents per pound, because almost nothing for the total cost of a good inoculant, and then you may lose 10-20% of your dry matter. It makes no sense. It's a really cheap technology compared to the impact it has.
Welcome to the Feed Science Podcast Show. I'm Adam Fahrenholz at North Carolina State University on behalf of Wyzenetics. Today, my guest is Federico Podversich. Federico, who goes by Fede, so that's what I'll be calling him as we go through, is coming to us as a PhD candidate from the University of Florida, working with some ruminant nutrition work. He's actually coming to us for today's podcast recordings from Germany. So welcome, Fede. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to participate in this podcast. And yeah, I'm glad to contribute with it.
Sure, absolutely. We're glad to have you. We like to give the opportunity. You'll be the I have to go back and count. Fourth or so, I think, maybe more of some of the kind of late stage graduate students that we've had come in, and that's always a fun conversation for hopefully for our audience. It certainly is for me, as we're talking to folks who are kind of in the midst of their research and sort of certainly passionate about the projects they're working on. For those that might not be familiar with the entire process, when I introduce Fede as a PhD candidate, that means that he's gone through his preliminary exams and he's in the last year or so of his work there as he finishes up some projects. And he's, as I mentioned, he's coming to us from Germany where he's doing some collaborative work as well. So before we get started, Fede, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself a little bit to the audience, your background, your kind of education, and then how you got to what you're working on now, and then a bit of what you are currently working on as well would be great.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening today. I'm originally from Argentina, from the center of the country in a city called Ramirez, in the state of Entre Rios. It's very close to Uruguay. That's the way people easily locate me. I did my bachelor's degree. I am a veterinarian. I studied at the Universidad del Litoral, is the name, in the state of Santa Fe, which is also in the center of the country. I come from a family which is closely related to agriculture, and my area, the city where I live, where I grew up, is an important agricultural area. So that's how I got connected to it. During my stay in veterinary school, I started working on research, and I participated also from an exchange where I was able to study in Brazil as well for 6 months at the University of Paspundo. And then finally, 2007, I came to Florida for an internship with Dr. Nicolas Di Lorenzo in his ruminant nutrition team. And there I stood to complete my master's that I finished in 2020. And right away I started my PhD, always working with ruminant nutrition, mainly beef cattle, in different topics, but we cover some cow-calf, some backgrounding, also mainly backgrounding, I would say. It's my work, but we are also a big team, and we very diverse areas. So yeah, that's a bit of my story. Right now, at this moment, I'm working on a collaborative research with the University of Kiel in the north of Germany, very close to the Denmark border, close to Hamburg as well, for education. And yeah, that's a bit about myself and who I am.
Eastman serves veterinarians and nutritionists in agrochemical and animal health industries by helping them select, evaluate, and implement innovative nutritional programs. Eastman works with your team to customize your gut health approach in feed and water. Eastman's approach addresses nutritional and bacterial challenges and finds new ingredient preservation and hygiene solutions. Explore ways to accelerate and innovate your programs. Contact the animal nutrition team at eastman.com.
Excellent. So we're gonna actually talk to Fede over a couple of episodes here. In the first one, in this episode, we're gonna primarily focus on some things related to silage. So, but before we get into that, being that this is kind of the feed science, and we talk a lot about the making of feed. So I'll ask you to explain a little bit to folks that might not be familiar how exactly we make and we make silage and just the very basic side of it is, and then we'll have you explain some of the interesting things you've been working on. But just from a standpoint, I'm interested because of your background, obviously coming from Argentina, where there's a lot of beef cattle raised, and then you've been doing work in the U.S. You mentioned Brazil in there, and now you're in Germany. From a feeding and a management growing perspective, what is different on the beef cattle side from South America to the US, North America, and then in Europe? What are the similarities and what are the differences in how we actually feed beef cattle around those different areas you've been involved with?
Well, yeah, that's an excellent question. I think to understand the difference, I think we need to understand the context, and sometimes the cattle production is seen as less intensive or less sophisticated, but it actually is driven by profit. I would say the main difference from South America to the US is that in some countries, South America, you still have a greater proportion of animals, of cattle, especially ruminants, fed on more grazing situations. Even though feedlots, we have very sophisticated feedlots, we have big feedlots, maybe not as many as very large feedlots, like the 100,000 cattle. We don't have many of those, but we have several smaller ones, maybe 1,000 to 5,000 head. But the biggest problem we have is that the price of cereals is an international price, right? But the price of meat is not always the same. So a fat steer in Argentina depends what on some regulations, but the price can be half or 30% or 25% of what is in the US. So the relationship on the price of meat that the producer sells, or carcass, the price of the carcass, to the price of the input in feed, really makes it more detrimental. Okay, in Brazil, for example, there are a lot of the livestock is still fed on just on grass, but it's because of this. It's not a high-end product; it's a cheap meat. In Argentina, the same. But there are countries that are buying that meat. Okay, we sell a lot of cow to China. They just require beef. Okay, it's not going to be choice, but it can be a good, profitable scheme for some producers. Even though, as I mentioned, we also have a large feedlot industry where they produce very high-end quality of beef. We are actually exporting to US, and it's growing now. The meat from Argentina, I see more and more in the US coming. But yeah, we have the problem with the cost, and the feed is affected by that. The feed that we use and what proportion of the cattle. I think in the US right now, how much beef is finished on grass. Almost only the program, right? Only animals are branded in a special program, but not regularly. That's one big difference. The other difference is that because we don't have all the same transportation, it's not so common to transport byproducts distances as, for example, 300, 400, 500 miles. So products are more used locally in Argentina as compared to the US. You will not transport DDGs 1,000 kilometers or 400 miles, for example. In Argentina, no, because of the price of transportation is much higher.
Okay. So that would certainly change the market of what kind of ingredients can be used in feed as well. So that certainly makes a lot of sense. Is where here, when rail is running the way that it's supposed to be, and when trucks are running and all that other kind of stuff, and we have enough drivers, we can move those byproducts as well as plenty of cereal grains and things around. For those, we often don't think too much about things like feedlot feeding when we think about feed manufacturing in general. We're often thinking either about the intensive vertically integrated operations associated with swine or poultry, or we're thinking about commercial operations feeding smaller groups of animals or companion animals, equines, things like that, because a lot of the manufacturing quote that goes along with feedlots, similar to as it is with dairy, is somewhat more simplistic, at least from a flow standpoint. Steam flaking some cereal grains, doing some mixing with total mixed rations, TMR, and then giving it to the cattle. Simple in flow, not simple to do, though. And I was just going to mention all that. If anybody that's listening ever has the opportunity to go see a large cattle feedlot operation, it's something you should take advantage of. It's a very interesting environment. Like you mentioned, if you go to one that's 100,000 head and you've got every combination of trucks going in and out with cattle and going in and out with food, and there's still some old time way of doing things with pen riders on horseback, but then there's some very, very advanced ways of sorting cattle as you run them into sorting areas where they're being ultrasounded and using artificial intelligence to take pictures of them, and then gates opening automatically to put them back in different pens and all that. It's a really cool operation to see. So anybody that's never gotten the opportunity, I would recommend it. So let's jump in to now some of the major work that you've done related to one of the feeding streams for cattle, which is silage. So before we go into some of the work you've done, can you explain to the audience what the process is of creating silage and why we do that for cattle?
So regarding silage, for those that maybe have never heard or are not related to this, I would say an easy way to compare to human feed is a preserved feed, and it's close. It could be related to a pickle feed. So basically, what you do is you harvest a forage or a given feed wet, so you don't want the moisture to go the dry matter content to go above 40% or below 30%. You want to be in this range, and you want this to ferment in an anaerobic environment. And this can be done in different ways. Can be stored in a plastic bag, or it could be pressed and in a bunker. But your goal is to create an aerobic environment, so the bacteria that will grow in this media, and you many times or most of the time you should add some specific bacteria that will help you. They will produce organic acids that will reduce the pH, and with this reduction of the pH, the feed can be preserved for long periods. And it's done for different reasons. One of them, the most important, I think, it's a better feed for animals. The animals are able to obtain more energy and consume um, more pounds of feed as compared to hay, for example. If you do grass hay or grass silage, the silage, they should be able to consume more. And also they will obtain more nutrients. So that's one reason why people do. The second reason, I would say, it happens in very wet climates. For example, you don't have a choice when the grass will not dry, right, enough, or will not dry adequately. You will also, instead of doing hay, regular hay, you may do a haylage or a silage bag with grass or something like this, because you just can't. I would say the third reason, some species like corn or sorghum is really not. It wouldn't be very practical to do hay, but it's really practical to chop the whole plant and bag it or store it in a bunker as silage, and it ferments really well. So it's really adequate. Those are really adequate forages to do silages, for example.
Okay, excellent. Again, my guest today from the University of Florida, PhD candidate Federico Podversich. So you mentioned we use hay or grass rather, grass for silage, especially when we can't hay it. We also will use different versions of like cereal grains. All right, so in the U.S. we certainly ensile a lot of corn, harvesting corn long before we would harvest that corn if we were taking it for the grain, whether it be feed corn or whether it be sweet corn for humans. We're harvesting it while it's still green. And then we also will occasionally use things like sorghum and do sorghum silage. So I know that that's been some of the work that you've been doing. So what are some of the key differences when we're talking about those cereal silages like a corn and a sorghum? What are the differences in why we would use either one, how they impact cattle, what advantages they have from growing, any of those kinds of different things that you guys have looked at?
Okay, so I think as from a nutritive standpoint, these are different species. They will provide different nutrients. I would say the decision to use one or the other may not always be only dependent on the nutritive quality, because if you want to use 100%, if you put all your decision, you base it only on the nutritive quality, you will always use corn silage and anything else, right? As a silage. The problem is, if you are in an area which is get flooded or it's really wet, in South Florida, for example, it will be very hard to grow corn. It will be very hard to grow sorghum if it gets an inch of water standing for 30 days, right? But you can do, for example, limpo grass, which is in a variety the university is working on. It will grow really well in these very wet conditions, and you can harvest and do silage and have or haylage or something similar. You can have this for cow calves mainly, or as the base of the diet if you supplement for another category maybe. So the conditions, the agronomic conditions will dictate which group of species or type of forages you can use. When you get into the decision of one or the other, when you can, for example, if you can do corn or you can do sorghum, all right, then you will look at another things, all right? Corn, as I mentioned, is the highest has the highest nutritive value or a greater nutritive value. Sorghum is a bit lower. It's basically the NDF is a bit more lignified and can degrade lower, and also the starch. So it should have, or normally it has less starch than corn, and the starch degrades is lower. So, and also it has some constraints in the processing of the kernel of the sorghum. So people will always prefer corn. However, the crop can be real. Two things in favor of sorghum is that the crop is more water resistant. And yeah, it's more tolerable than that. It's not that you can plant it and mistreat it. Okay, this is one thing I always talk to people. They ask me, I say it's still a crop. You still should fertilize. You still should take care of insects and weeds, but under very hot weather or some dry moments of the year, it will do better than corn. Another thing is it also depends what you want to use it for. Okay, it's not the same if you want to feed a high lactating dairy cow. In those cases, most people, mainly exclusively, will choose corn. As if you want to feed, for example, backgrounding heifers. If you need to grow heifers, there's one thing that you don't want is you don't want them to overgrow. You don't want them to grow 3 pounds a day because they will get fat, and also this can hurt their lactating capacity in the future. So for that, in those cases, for example, a sorghum, it can be more suitable. And even between species, there are different hybrids, right? And varieties. So I would suggest to people who's looking into using silages to find help from the universities. Every university has their own extension agents and experts who can help you to choose your best, but not only crop, but also the variety that will fit your operation. And in the case of specifically beef cattle, that is what we work. I think sorghum is in Argentina, we have a say that we say you are feeding the cows candies. Sorghum for a cow, for a beef cow, is a candy, even for a growing animal. Okay, it's more than what they need. We've got very high intakes and very high rates of gain only with sorghum silage. A good sorghum silage, either forage or grain varieties. Only with that and some protein correction. This is very important. Okay, the silage is not a complete diet. You need to supplement protein, and these are different ways of doing it. I can comment some ideas we've been working on, and it really works. I would say normally what we do is we use, for example, cottonseed meal, or we've been also working with carinata meal, which is a new variety. Another student in my lab is working with this. You can use soybean meal. You can use gluten, any high protein source. Also, in some occasions, which is really nice, and I've seen it working very well, people will let the animals graze a winter grass, for example, ryegrass or oats or something, and this will be the source of protein, and then they supplement with sorghum or corn silage. And then you have a diet that is based almost entirely in forages, plus some minerals, okay, that you will probably have to supplement. But this is really useful, and you get very adequate rates of gain for growing animals. That would be the thing to consider, adequate. Because people say, oh no, my cattle only gain 2 pounds a day. Okay, but for a growing animal, this can be perfect.
Sure. Excellent.
Yeah.
So we've got grass type silage, and we've got corn type silage, and then, as you talked quite a bit about there, we've got sorghum based silage, and sorghum having some real advantages of where it can be grown and what it can tolerate. I do like the point that you pointed out that we always talk about sorghum, or people may call it Milo. I think it's got a third name too. In the middle of Kansas, I always thought it was Milo until I moved away, and then it became sorghum somewhere else. We always talk about it being drought tolerant, but I think you made a really good point of no, it's drought tolerant. It's not, we plant it and we never pay any attention to it. So we've got all these different options, and they have their different advantages depending on where we're using them. For our last few minutes here on this topic for this episode, can you give us some idea of what's required on the silage side from a processing standpoint as it's harvested and as it's chopped? And then the different, you had mentioned already, we've got the large plastic ag bags, so the big long white tubes that we might see out in the field somewhere. And then we've got bunkers that we pack it into and then cover to get that anaerobic environment in order to get the bacteria to start doing their work. So what are some of the considerations that we have to think about from a processing standpoint and a storage and getting that fermentation to go? And then what are some of the areas that are being researched to, improve that process and make it more efficient?
All right. I will go by, first I will cover the processing. And for that, I want to say it's mainly necessary for corn and sorghum, more for sorghum, because the pericarp of the kernel is harder. And the bacteria, either the bacteria in the fermentation of the silage or in the rumen, will not access the starch in the grain if the pericarp is broken. Okay, you can see very well when you feed sorghum, if it's whole grain, you can see the grains in the feces, in the manure. And if someone doesn't believe me, there's plenty of work by, for example, Dr. Fred Owens and several other people who has demonstrated the benefits of processing. Regarding the kernel processor that is inside of the self-propelled harvester, there are a few things that you can adjust that will help increase that processing. So make the processing better to break this grain. The first and most important is the roll gap. So these processors, they work with two rolls, okay? That they could be different types, different type of teeth, and different differential speed. But the distance between one roll and the other, for sorghum, there is some research that, especially from some years ago with Dr. Luis Furrereto and his team, they demonstrate the benefits to go into 1 millimeter roll gap. Okay, this is important, 1 millimeter. The second thing I want to mention that helps is the length of the fiber. So the length of the chopping of the whole plant. Because the way this and you say, how this affects, if it's going to pass through the roll after? Well, the rolls these rolls have a spring that when very coarse material comes through, they will let the rolls separate. To avoid this to happen more often, you should try to provide a shorter pieces. So this you can make it with a reduced theoretical length of cut, that is called. We normally at the university there we work with 15 millimeters for sorghum, and we have had good results. But I think if you even lower, it can help. But here you are hurting your physical effective fiber, right? So that you want some to stimulate chewing. So it will all depends what you want to use it for later or not. And you can also work on the speed differential of the two rolls. So the greater this difference, so the speed differential will be how fast one roll moves in compared to the other one. This could be 20%, it could be 60%. The greater that difference, the more shredded the material will be. So it will be like ripped apart. Okay? I don't know if this makes sense. And when you don't have the opportunity to do a good processing, okay? Because this always happens. People can say, oh, I cannot process, or I cannot adjust this. No, I can only go to 3 millimeters. There are two things you can do to improve the utilization of the starch. First of all, harvest maybe in a lower stage. You might lose some dry matter accumulation and some starch if you harvest earlier, but the pericarp will be softer. And the second thing you can do is storage for a long time, because proteins within the silage, they will degrade over time, right? So over time, this storage will help in the utilization of the starch, because the pericarp will degrade. It will not be perfect, but it will help.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the second question you made
on the different technologies of actually doing the ensiling. So the ag bags versus the pits and what the advantages are of each, disadvantages of each, how they work, and what we might see in the future as well.
Okay, first about them, the different types of silage, and I would say it's important to say that both are useful and both can work. I would say the definition, if you use one or the other, you go talk to your contractor with the person who's doing the harvest for you, what they can do.
Right? Sure. Yeah.
And that's also the main limitation in all this. We talk about processing methods, harvesting, but then you face that you only have one person in your area and have this type of equipment and it works this way, and that's a problem. So first of all, make sure that the person who can do it. I think, well, the bag has a cost, maybe an extra cost of the bag, but it's really good, it's really nice, and works well. In some occasions, when you have in very large operations, it might not be possible because the number of bags you would need to store feed for example, a 100,000 head feedlot, they will always use concrete banks in that case. But for a small scale operations, I think the bag is really useful. Works well, and it really doesn't add too much cost to the final product. But also, let me mention one thing. It is very important. The people sometimes forget about this, and it's really important to inoculate the silage when they do it. It's really, really beneficial. If one thing they take from this podcast is please inoculate your silages. It will help in the reduction of that pH. And it can also help, depends on what type it is. It can help in the life shelf of it, or after you open the aerobic stability, that is called, which is how much time you can have them exposed to air without this material going bad. Because if you put all the effort in the crop, if you put all the effort in the harvest, and then you forgot to add a few cents per pound, because almost nothing for the total cost of a good inoculant, and then you may lose 10-20% of your dry matter. It makes no sense. It's a really cheap technology compared to the impact it has. And they should always do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in there, we're talking about actually inoculating with a prepared, cultured bacteria instead of just relying on what we hope is present in the environment. Right.
Yes, and there are companies working actively and universities studying for better inoculants that will help you to degrade the feed better, to reduce the pH, to control the growth of undesired microorganisms. So it's a really, really useful technology and should always be utilized. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, it's been a great conversation on kind of the cropping choice when it comes to silage, and then the technologies that go along with it. I really appreciate you giving the listeners some information on that. And we even got into some conversations there on the processing, and when you talk about roll gap and things like that, those are things we talk about in the feed mill. But now we're just talking about it in a harvester out in the field. But some of that same discussion we have on particle size reduction and how we manage the equipment. It's like a roller mill and a feed mill, but it's mobile out in the field. So had some nice crossover there. Federico is going to join us again for a future podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about additives that go into ruminant feed. So look forward to having that conversation as well. So again, for today, my guest has been Federico Podversich. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Florida working in ruminant nutrition. Fede, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir. And it was my pleasure.
Again, I'm Adam Fernholz, coming to you from North Carolina State University, and this has been the Feed Science Podcast Show. Thanks for listening.